Hey everyone, I'm back with another video. So in this video, I'm going to be covering X670E, X670, B650E, and B650. So basically, we're going to explain all the kind of ins and outs of how the platforms differ from each other, what they include, what they don't include, all that sort of the ins and outs essentially of how each of them are different. And we're going to take a look at a couple of motherboards for illustrative purposes. So without further ado, let's get right into it. A quick shout out to an article from Techpowerup back from May of this year. So they actually published a AM5 explained article. So I encourage everybody to go read that article. I will leave a link to that in the description below. But essentially, that article explains, it has these really good images, these diagrams that I've actually taken from the website because they're just so good at illustrating. A picture's worth 1,000 words, they say. Essentially, you have two things, right? When you buy into a new CPU and motherboard platform, you have the CPU itself. So in this case, we're dealing with an AMD AM5 CPU. So that's going to come with its own lanes. And then it's also going to come with things like display output because we have integrated graphics now on these CPUs. And then as well as some USB ports that wire directly to the CPU. So that's different from Intel because Intel doesn't actually have any USB ports that natively wire to the CPU socket. They all have to go through the chipset. So it's worth noting that this single USB 2 port in particular, I want to point that one out because that one is usually what the motherboard manufacturers will directly connect the onboard audio. So the integrated audio ports that you see on the back, like your line out, your mic, your optical, SPDIF, like those are going to go into this USB 2.0 port and go directly into the CPU. So that means that the audio on these boards is going to be really nice. It's going to have very, very low latency because we are bypassing the entire chipset in most cases. Now, it is up to the motherboard manufacturer's discretion to wire the audio up to this USB port, for instance. They don't have to do that. In the case of ASRock, I think on at least one of ASRock's boards that I've looked at, they actually wire it through the chipset. So it really kind of boils down to how their implementation is. But that's why I encourage everybody who's interested in picking up a particular motherboard, I definitely recommend getting a motherboard that includes the block diagram in the user's manual. That will make things much easier, less headaches involved in trying to figure out resource sharing, lane allocation, that sort of thing. But for today's illustration, we're going to be using the X670E Aorus Master from Gigabyte as the example. We will talk about some of the differences between that board and say something like the Asus Crosshair Hero or the MSI Meg Ace and the ASRock Tai Chi. So those are kind of the main ones that I usually look at if I'm evaluating one brand from another. So in addition to the CPU, you also get the chipset. And the cool thing here is I think this is going to answer a lot of questions. So whether you're getting a B650 or an X670 board, you're getting the exact same chipset layout. The only difference is if you're going for the higher end X670, you actually get two of what's shown in this table here. So imagine everything you see here on the left, but you get this times two. So you get double of what's shown here, what I've circled. So a single B650 motherboard includes all of this connectivity, all of it, for B650 and B650E. X670 board will have a whole set of this, plus a whole entire another set of it. Okay, so that's twice. You essentially get double what you get. Well, not exactly double because, as we'll show, it's not exactly double. Essentially, 4 of these express lanes will have to be for uplink purposes or downlink purposes. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So I guess now the next thing to explain is what's the difference between the E and the non-E. So like if I have, say, an X670E, what's the difference between that versus X670? So the difference is going to be on the AM5 interface. It all boils down to this. So the only difference is that if you opt for the higher end B650E or X670E, this entire set of lanes, all these lanes, or PCIe Gen 5. If you opt for the lower cost X670 or B650, you will get 4 lanes of Gen 5, but these other lanes right here will be Gen 4. That is to say, you get 4 lanes of Gen 5 and 20 lanes of Gen 4 for an X670 or a B650 board. I hope that makes sense, because this is the sort of thing that I think a lot of people are confused on, and they don't. People think that, oh, well, does this board have Gen 5 or does it not have Gen 5? The bottom line is if it has the E, all of your CPU lanes will be Gen 5, all of them. If you have a non-E board, X670 or B650, only the last 4 lanes will be Gen 5. The main lanes here will be a PCIe 4.0 bus. And we'll illustrate that toward the end of the video. We're going to show block diagrams for motherboard manuals that will show this in practice. So now let's get into the actual CPU lanes. So like I said, we're going to be using an X670E Aorus Master block diagram that I've derived as an exercise here to kind of showcase how this works. So with the X670E, that implies you get the full 24 lanes of PCIe 5.0, right? So it's going to be, on the diagram, that's going to be what's in yellow. That's going to be this stuff right here. This set right here where it says 2 chipset, this is also Gen 5. That is going to be the uplink, or downlink rather, toward the chipset, okay? That's what that's going to be. Now the thing is, with the general purpose lanes, AMD has required that the motherboard manufacturers allocate 4 of them for at least 1 M.2 slot. So at least 1 M.2 slot will be Gen 5 capable. And this applies to every single chipset. So from the highest end X670E all the way to the budget-oriented B650 board, you will get at least 1 M.2 Gen 5 drive slot on the board. The second one, which this one is up to the manufacturer's discretion how they want to allocate these 4 lanes. So in the case of Gigabyte, so for the Aorus Master that we're looking at here, they give you a second M.2 Gen 5 capable slot. So you can do 2 native Gen 5 drives directly wired to the CPU off of that particular board. Now for some other motherboards, just to use MSI's Ace as an example, MSI, instead of giving you a second M.2, what they've actually done is they've given you a PCIe expansion slot. So they give you a PCIe X4 expansion slot, which can be really nice because, you know, it's an open slot. It's 5.0 lanes. There's 4 of them. You can do whatever you want. You can wire in a high-end capture card, but even that's not going to use the full bandwidth because it's Gen 5. So, you know, you could put an add-in card for a single M.2 drive if you wanted. Now, the Ace board does include that Expander Pro, or that Expander card that has, you know, two Gen 5 drives that can go in there, and that's going to be 8 lanes electrically. So, but that would actually go into the second expansion slot, which shares lanes with the GPU. So that's going to be a little bit different. But the third slot on that board is going to be an open slot. So we want to show you guys what I mean by that is if we go over to the product page for MSI, so here on their website for the Meg X670E Ace, you know, the top slot is going to be the X16. The second slot is going to be an X8 that when it's active, it pulls 8 lanes off of the top slot. So that's that. But then this bottom slot down here is an open, free 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 5 that doesn't share bandwidth with the graphics card and is not being shared with like an M.2 or something. So it's not gonna disable something as soon as you plug something in there. So that's really, really nice that they give you that. So that's just one example of a board that does something different. Just to use another motherboard as an example, if we look at ASRock's Tai Chi, they don't give you the third expansion slot, but instead what they decided to give you was USB 4. aka Thunderbolt 4. So they give you get dual Thunderbolt USB-C ports on the back. That's the 40 gig ports straight off of the CPU. They wire directly to the CPU. That's because they've integrated the Intel Thunderbolt 4 controller into the motherboard and wired directly onto those 4 lanes of Gen 5. So that kind of gives you guys an idea of how the resources were allocated, and it's quite fascinating. We've done live streams covering this sort of content, answering viewers' questions, answering subscriber questions, on what motherboard for what scenario. So that's kind of what this is addressing today in this video. So that's going to be the use case there for that extra set of general purpose lanes, right? And then of course you get the GPU there. So in addition to that, the CPU gives you a bunch of display outputs. So you could run, for example, they could wire up a DV or DisplayPort. They could wire up HDMI. I mean, they could even do DVI if they wanted, but I mean, I haven't seen anybody do that. But the option's there, right? And then you get USB. You get 4 USB 10 gig ports essentially that go directly to the CPU. So that's going to be the actual CPU lanes. So you got USB and a bunch of PCIe. So it's really nice Gen 5. So, and again, if you have a B650E board, or even if you get a B650 board, you get access to all of these lanes, and they're all Gen 5. So that's really, really nice. So I really think the B650, the B650E in particular, is very good value for money. And I think like the highest end board I've seen, like the Gigabyte B650E or its master, I think it's like a $350 board, which is pretty much the same price as the previous gen X670, but you're getting all this Gen 5 connectivity and stuff, so it's still pretty good. So people talking about platform costs being super expensive, that to me that doesn't seem like that's super crazy. Plus you're getting the postcode debug on top of that. So just to kind of show sort of an example here. So this is the Gigabyte B650E or its master, and you can see just kind of showing the pictures here. I wish I could zoom, but you can see you get the postcode debug. This is a $350 motherboard at launch, this month, and you still get the full Gen 5 and everything. Plus, you get a whole lot of connectivity on the back. You get the BIOS, flashback, everything. So for $350. People complaining, saying that it's too overpriced. I don't really think so. I'm not seeing it because this is pretty good value, considering all things considered. I mean, you can run everything. The VRM, the 105 amp, 16 plus 2. So it's very capable. So yeah, I definitely recommend B650 for most users. So let's get into the chipset now for the X670E. So and I guess, we'll talk about how the B650E and the B650 chipset differs. But essentially, a single B650 chipset by itself, that would be the B650 board. But if you have 2 of them in a daisy chain configuration like here, this is going to be a X670 board. Regardless of X670 or X670E, nothing here is different between the 2 of them. Because remember, the E only denotes the CPU lane speeds, whether we're talking 5.0 all 24 or only 4 lanes of 5.0 and 20 lanes of Gen 4. All right, so for the chipset, 4 of these lanes go down here. So if we're looking at this primary chipset here, we'll call this the primary, and then this one will be the secondary. So the primary chipset has 4 lanes to the CPU. So that's going to be the lanes going this way. It has 4 PCIe 4.0 lanes that can be allocated to whatever the motherboard manufacturer decides to do. So in the case of the Aorus Master, they've allocated that to an M.2 drive. That's going to use 4 lanes, and it's going to be at Gen 4 capable. And then of course, all this USB 2, these 2 combined makes a USB 3.2 Gen 2.2, so that's a 20 gigabit port. So that's going to be a single 20 gig port off of that primary chipset. And then these are going to be like 10 gig ports, so that's the USB right there. And then of course the USB 2.0. And then you have a PCIe 3.0 that can be shared with SATA. So this is where your SATA drives are going to come in. So typically 4 drives can be allocated on the primary chipset, and that's how they've done it on this board. So you get 4 SATA drives that can support, you know, RAID 0, RAID 1, etc. So that's going to be that. And then finally, the only remaining lanes on here are this second set right here of Express 4.0, and that for the primary chipset is what is going to be used to connect to the second chipset. So, okay, so that's going to be tying up those lanes going to the downstream to the second chipset, and that's the reason why you can't really use these as general purpose lanes on the primary chipset. And that's the reason why what I was saying earlier is when I said that X670 was 2x B650, that's not exactly true, because the primary chipset can't actually wire these lanes to anything other than the downlink. So that's going to be going to the downlink. Okay? Okay, so for the secondary chipset then, you do have both 4.0 blocks. So you can use all 8 lanes for things. So in this case, you know, you could use that for those lanes could be for an M.2. And if we look at this, we have 2 CPU wired Gen 5 SSDs, and we can do 2 Gen 4 SSDs off of the chipset. Okay, but these are wired through the chipset, so I don't really know if I'd want to do RAID with these two. If I was going to do a RAID 0, I would probably do the CPU ones, those two together. I wouldn't do these because they're kind of like in they go through the chipset, so I don't know if there'll be a latency penalty doing that, but that's just something to be aware of. And then you have another set of 4 lanes that this could be, you know, you could wire up a Thunderbolt controller for USB 4. You could wire up another M.2. It's kind of open. You could do 10 gig LAN. You know, it's kind of open-ended for the motherboard manufacturer. But what Gigabyte went and did is they put a PCIe X4 expansion slot on the board, so a free open slot. And in one of my videos I've done, I have added a Thunderbolt add-in card. So the GC Maple Ridge is what I have added to this expansion slot. Okay, so that's going to be the expansion slot. That's going to be the M.2 drive. So that leaves us, and then this right here is the uplink to this primary. So that leaves, you know, a bunch of USB 3.2, another USB 20 gig. So we have all of that. So what's left then is our PCIe 3.0 4 lanes right here. And what that's going to be in this case, you know, that is what they're going to wire up for your Wi-Fi 6E, for your LAN. That can be 1 gig LAN, or that can also be a 2.5 gig LAN. And then the remaining 2, you could put 2 more SATA drives, which is what these are over here. I kind of illustrated that. This is SATA drives. Or you could do what they've done here is kind of interesting. They put like a PLX switch, and then they put like a PCI X2 expansion slot here that shares with the SATA. So meaning if you plug in, say, an AverMedia Live Gamer 2 or an Elgato HD60 for 1080p 60 recording for like console footage or whatever, or if you're doing like dual PC capture, you just want to capture some video off of a capture card, those older capture cards, this would be ideal for that. And as soon as you plug in that, you cannot use those 2 SATA ports. And also, yeah, I wouldn't recommend raiding these with these because they're on like the second chipset. So that's something to be aware of. But that's going to depend. That's going to be very vendor specific. So it really boils down to what motherboard you choose is going to dictate like how this is kind of allocated, right? So that's going to be it. So real quick, if we wanted to talk about what is B650 look like, this is what a B650 board would look like. In this particular case, this is what a B650E motherboard would look like because you have the full 24 lanes of Gen 5. So just to illustrate that, let's take a look at some of these motherboard manuals just to kind of show what the block diagrams look like, just to put this into practice for practical application. So if we come here, we look at the B650E Aorus Master. So in the block diagram, in the manual, they have the block diagram, which is very, very good on Gigabyte's part. I think Gigabyte, MSI, and ASRock give you the block diagram in these motherboard manuals, and that's really nice. Asus is the only one that for some reason doesn't want to share their manual or share their block diagram for their manuals. So you can see here with the B650E, essentially what they're doing is you have that full 8 lanes of PCIe 4.0 on the chipset. So, you know, 2 of those go to an expansion slot, 4 of them go to another expansion slot, then you got Wi-Fi, then you have LAN. So if you add all these together, 2 plus 4, that's 6, plus 1, that's 7, plus 1, that's 8. That's going to be your full chipset, 8 lanes of Gen 4. Then you have a 3.0 bus, and what I said earlier is that the SATA and the 3.0 bus, it's either or, right? So in this case, they're taking all 4 SATA drives and they're using up the entire PCIe bus for 4 SATA drives. So that's going to be your Gen 3. And then you've got the codec here. That's going to be wired to the 2.0 on the CPU. But what's interesting with this B650E board is you're getting the full 24 lanes of Gen 5. So as you add them up, it's 16 plus 4 plus 4 more because there are 2 drives here. So this is 4 plus 4 more because there's 2. So that's 8 plus 16, that's 24. Now there's a switch. So if you want to drive, for instance, 2 more M.2 drives, as soon as you insert the third, like let's say you put 1, 2, the third one, that's going to be pulling lanes off of the GPU via the switch. So you can do like a by 8 for the GPU, and then by 4, and then that's going to be 2 more drives. So 4 Gen 5 capable M.2s, with the only caveat being that the GPU is going to run at X8. This is very similar to how the Intel Z790, the new Intel Z790 boards have to do something similar to this in order to get Gen 5 M.2 compatibility, because they don't have the ability to do that because on the Intel platforms, unfortunately, they only have 16 lanes of Gen 5 that are supposed to go to the GPU. So if you want an M.2 drive that does Gen 5 on an Intel motherboard, you're going to have to drop your GPU down to by 8 speed. There's no other way around that unless you literally just don't run an M.2 drive in that primary slot at the top of the motherboard. So that's going to be something for probably another video. So for the X670, if we look at, you know, an X670 board, you know, again, now you have 2 chipsets, so that gives you a lot more options for connectivity. It essentially adds 4 more 4.0, so you can put like another drive there, and then 4 more lanes of Gen 3. So that allows you to offload your LAN and Wi-Fi on one side, like down here, for instance, and then your SATA and the SATA drives can be on their own bus on one of the chipsets. So that's basically it. You can see that the nice thing about the X670E is that it's full 24 lanes of Gen 5, 16 to the GPU, 4 to an M.2, and then 4 more for either another M.2. So that's going to be 24 lanes to the CPU. So hope you guys found this video useful. I hope this answers the question of the difference between B650, B650E, X670, X670E. It really kind of boils down to whether you go with an E or a non-E. I personally would recommend the B650E. I think that one gives you the full Gen 5 24 lanes without too much of a drawback. And then you still do get the benefits of the price point being a lot cheaper than going with X670 if you don't really need all that extra connectivity. But again, it depends on the use case. So yeah, I guess with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this in-depth content like this. If you have a question on a particular motherboard, or if you're trying to do a specific build for either work or school or some kind of use case, maybe if it's just even gaming, just leave a comment down below and I'll see if I can reply back if I have the time. But yeah, if you like this type of in-depth videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. It makes me feel motivated to keep making more videos like this for everyone out there who likes tech-related info and stuff like this. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks.